Howdy, this is Tubalcain once again. Now in the last video I talked about different ways of cutting and snipping and shearing sheet metal, lightweight metal, and this one I'm going to talk about different ways of forming holes or cutting holes in sheet metal, light gauge metal, like punching and hole saws and drilling and things like that. Now, if you haven't watched my other videos, I have well over 300 shop videos, so be sure and watch them, subscribe to my channel, and tell your friends about it. And now on with the video. If you do not have a well-equipped shop, one of the easiest ways, without special tools, of putting small holes in sheet metal is just with a punch. And these are standard, well, this is a pin punch, and I guess you would call this a starter punch, and they need to be nice and sharp, that is just squared off on the end on the belt sander, so that there's no little nicks or anything in there, and it's truly a sharp end on it. And you need some hardwood. Here's some hardwood. I got some maple, I got some, I believe this is ash, and this is a lead plate, in case you have one of those, and this is just a piece of plastic that they use when they're building houses, and I'm not sure what kind it is, but just so you got something to punch as a backing as you're punching. So let's try this on this 28 gauge galvanized to start with. And we'll start with an 1/8 inch punch, and you know, I like to use a copper or brass hammer when I use punches because it doesn't have a tendency to slip off. It bites into it, as opposed to using a steel hammer, which often gives you a glancing blow. And all you're going to do here is to put the sheet metal on the backing, whatever material you're using, and strike it. And that'll of course go right into the wood, and the slug of metal is left in there. And there we've got an 1/8 inch hole, and you'll need to tap that because it's going to bend it just a little bit. Now let's see how we do with a 3/16, and I'll use the lead plate for that. And you can make your own lead plate, which I did by just casting it. Let's see if we can get through this. Use a heavy hammer. And I gave it several whacks, and the slug is down there in the lead, and there's a 3/16 hole. Now punching is one of the older ways of doing this into metal. Before they had drills and machinery, and the thicker metals, they use what they call a hot punch, so the metal would be red hot when they do that, so you can go through quite thick metal with a hot punch. And these of course are for cold work, and that's where they got the name cold chisel for cutting cold metal, and there's a hot chisel for cutting red hot thick metal. And I have here some thin aluminum and some thin brass, so we'll punch that. Sometimes it's a little bit harder to do because this will deform on you. Notice how I rotate the punch a little bit as I'm doing that. That's brass, and this is very thin aluminum. That punch is very nice. And you might be able to use larger punches. Not that anybody is ever going to do this, but that's how to punch holes into thin metal using common punches that everyone has. There are all kinds of mechanical punches to punch through slightly thicker metal, and this is about 1/16 inch aluminum, and here we have some 24 gauge cold roll steel. And I like these Whitney hand punches, and I've had these for years. And be sure and have several of these on hand so you don't have to change the punches. This one has a 3/16 punch in it, and this one has a 5/32 punch in it, and that one in the background has an 1/8 inch punch. Now, not that it's that big of a chore, but you know, it's going to take you 5 minutes or so to change the punch and the die in there. So that's why I like to have several of each tools if you can afford it. And be sure and get the quality American Whitney Johnson if you can. They must have made a million of these. They're all over the place as far as sales are concerned. So get yourself one of those. And using one of these is no different than using a common paper punch. And as you back it off, it'll strip the work off of the punch, and that makes a nice clean hole. And I'm not sure what the capacity of this is, but the directions in the box will tell you how thick you can punch. And try to avoid punching something so thick that you damage the punches. And there we go. That's aluminum. That's real easy punching. Nice clean hole. And if it's very hard where you cannot close this, either you got a dull punch or you're trying to punch metal that is too thick, and do not pound on these. You know, you're always going to see a hammer and chisel mechanic that's going to beat on this and break something. There's one in every shop, you know. Butcher, I mean. I forgot to tell you that this is called the Whitney No. 5 Junior. Now Whitney made these in several sizes, as you can see. This is the No. 2 hand punch. And it has handles that I suppose are about 2 foot long altogether. And they also made one that is more or less a screw or a helix here, and you rotate it rather than punch it, because this is similar construction to the Junior that I just showed you. And of course the punches are proportionately larger. So when you find these at sales, make sure you get the punches too. And if the punches are too badly worn or damaged, don't even bother buying it, because you can't afford to buy these punches. Some of them can be resharpened, I suppose, but generally it changes the length of them. And notice that they have the little pilot on them. I really like that. So if you center punch the location where you want the hole on your metal, you can then move it around until this little pilot pops into the center punch hole, and then the hole will be exactly where you want it. And I have a 1/2 inch punch in here right now. There's also a holder for these that turns this into a bench punch. It grips it right here so that it is held vertically on the bench. But this is also sometimes used in the field or wherever you need it. You can move it around easily. And you can take it off of that stand that I just told you, that bench stand, just with 2 set screws. I have one of those out in the garage. I also have several of these in the garage. I'm not going to bring them in. It's cold outside. And this operates exactly like the little one. And here it is in action, and that's just soft aluminum, so it doesn't take too much to punch it. Very clean holes if you have a sharp punch, and that's what the slugs look like. 1/2 inch. I have a whole drawer of what you would call hollow punches. And some of these actually are made for leather working or other late work. That's a hollow punch. This is called an arch punch, and the slugs come out here. Note that it's tapered. But if you're going to use any leather working tools on metal, make sure it's soft metal like aluminum and brass and so on. And using a wooden backing plate, these are still going to work okay. Let's try this one. And some of these are numbered. They have a number on them, rather like that's a number 13, whatever that means. So you need to measure it. But these work quite well on soft material. These are often used in gasket work as well. And then you will need to tap them flat. These might be of limited use in thicker metals or steel, but these are an option. Really, they're meant, I think, for gaskets and leather working. But I have used them in a pinch, but I have so many different ways of cutting holes that, you know, it's not something that I use all that often for this purpose. You can use a chisel to form these holes too. Now, I use woodworking chisels because I'm a metal worker, so I'm not so fussy about them, but I have a lot of old chisels. You know, these cost 25 cents, so I'm not worried about regrinding them or using them on metal, but this is just thin metal anyway. But there's a square hole with a 1/4 inch punch, and I particularly like this chisel, which I showed in one of my other videos with a steel handle, and that's also great if you want to chisel a hole, square hole. And that works really wonderfully with good hardwood on the back of it. Now when you use your hardwood, you need to rotate your material so you're always cutting across the grain rather than with the grain. So you need to think about that factor as you chisel these holes. Now there's a square hole that I made with a 1/2 inch wide chisel in galvanized metal. I believe this is 28 gauge, and I did that on the lead plate rather than wood, and it did take a little time. That's probably not something you'll ever want to do, but visualize you know, 100 or 150 years ago how they had to do some of this work, even though they probably didn't have sheet metal till around the time of the Civil War. And when you do this, you need to start your chisel more on one corner and kind of rock it so that you pierce the metal. And that really doesn't dull the chisel all that much. But don't use your fine Scorby woodworking chisels for that. I also have a whole drawer of this type of punch, which I call chassis punches, but there's different names for them. And Greenlee is the main company. I believe they're also out of Rockford, Illinois, that specialize in that type of tool. And they come in virtually any size, and some of them are what you would call conduit or knockout sizes. So they're going to be morphodite or hermaphrodite in between sizes. But you can also get them like this is 1.25 inches. And when we use the word chassis punch, you know, nobody really knows what a radio chassis or a TV chassis is much anymore. All different sizes, and I have some much bigger ones in there too. Some of them are available hydraulic also that they use on jobs. Here's one that has a thrust bearing right here because there's an awful lot of friction when you tighten these down. And here's a square one, which I will use here in a minute. And they came in all different sizes of square as well. Now the downside to using these chassis punches is that you need a hole to start with, and in this case that's a rather hefty hole there. So you need a 3/4 inch hole in order to form or cut a, let me see what size this is, a 2-inch diameter hole. So how are you going to get the 3/4 hole? I do not like drilling in sheet metal, although I'm going to cover that later in the video. So you might use one of the other methods that I have already shown you to form the hole, or it could be a very rough hole too. You could even chisel it out and then use this. If you've never used a chassis punch, there's one that's already installed. I'm all ready to tighten it up, and there's a 3/8 hole already in here to accommodate the screw. And then you put you sandwich the sheet metal between the two halves. Put a little oil on the thread to reduce friction. I am holding the bottom half of the chassis punch in the vise. It sure makes it easier. And then just tighten it until you pull the punch all the way through. Sometimes you'll hear it pop as it comes through. And then you can pull it right out of there like that. Boy, that leaves a nice clean hole. What a nice clean hole that is. But I must tell you that it's always a real pain in the neck to get the slug out of there, because you got to just take the whole thing apart. If you're doing a lot of holes, it's pretty time consuming. There's the slug. For my next trick, I'll use this square chassis punch. It requires a 1/2 inch hole, which I've already punched using that Whitney punch that I showed you a few minutes ago. Now when you use the square punch, there's keys and keyways that must correspond to one another, so that when you punch, the hardened punch doesn't strike the hardened die in the wrong spot, so that they're you know, parallel to one another and align with one another. So Into the 1/2 inch hole goes that part. Got to line the keyway up here. And the square knot. And I'm going to do that in the vise the same as I did the other one. Just easier to manage. And I'll hold the flats in the vise. The flats in the vise. And I've oriented the edge of the punch so it's approximately parallel with the edge of the work, but you may even have layout lines that you're following and you use something like this. Just using a big adjustable wrench. Be careful of sharp corners when you're doing this. And that's a very sharp punch. Matter of fact, it may never have been used. Makes a beautiful square hole. Really no burrs to amount to anything even. And that's how to make a square hole. And they sell those in different sizes.